Hello, everyone. This is part 2 of our episode about Nicholas Antoine Boulanger's book entitled Critical Examination of the Life of St. Paul. This is part of our series on the famous critical books on Paul. Boulanger was a author writing this book in 1746. He lived in France. He was a man of many different interests and careers. Anyway, we'll continue where we left off last time, and we'll do about 15 minutes. All right, so we're picking up from about page 13 of his book, and the heading I put for this section was Paul's Doctrines Just Coincidentally Give Him More Power to Grow. This is my intro to the quote. Boulanger then makes a point that obviously impressed Kierkegaard, that Paul's motivation for getting rid of the law was to increase proselytes and nothing more. Quote, "It proves to us that Paul and his associate Barnabas found it much easier to convert the Gentiles than the Jews, who showed themselves almost always rebels to their lessons. The docility of the first, meaning of the Gentiles, and the indocility, meaning the resistance, of the latter, meaning Jews, may be traced to very natural causes. The idolaters, meaning Gentiles, were destitute of instruction. Their priests, content with exacting from them their offerings and sacrifices, never thought of instructing, Acts of Apostles chapter 12, them in their religion. So there was no interest in teaching the idolaters anything about the Jewish faith. Thus, our missionaries, meaning Paul and Barnabas, encountered few obstacles in persuading them of the truth of the novelties which they came to announce to them. It was not thus with the Jews, who had a law to which they were very strongly attached, since they were convinced that it had been dictated by God himself. In consequence, our preachers, that is, Paul and Barnabas, could not make themselves listened to, but in proportion as the doctrine they preached agreed with the notions with which Jews were previously imbued. So in other words, there's no way you're going to persuade the Jewish people unless you can say something that'll sound similar to what they believe. But that's not true with the Gentiles. You can just go off the rails and say things completely at odds with the law, and the Gentiles don't care because it's not of concern to them, and they don't have to investigate the Jewish religion, the religion of Yahweh, to figure out if what Paul and Barnabas are saying is true. The apostles were therefore compelled to reason with the Jews according to their own system, meaning the 12 apostles. So they were at a different level. They had to deal with Jewish people on the faith of the Bible, the Word of God. All right, let's continue. The apostles were therefore compelled to reason with the Jews according to their own system, to show them that the Christ whom they announced was the Messiah, which they expected from their own prophets. In a word, in preaching the gospel to the Jews, the preachers, Paul and Barnabas, were driven into embarrassing discussions and perpetually exposed to cavils, meaning resistance, and contradictions which they had no fear of on the part of the Gentiles. In other words, Boulanger is saying is when those two would be talking to the Gentiles, they had no fear of contradiction because the people don't know the word of God. So you can easily pull the wool over the eyes of Gentiles, but you could not do that with the Jews. Anyway, continuing. So they would have no fear on the part of the Gentiles, who received without disputing the novelties which they broached to them, and which besides agreed well enough with the notions of the pagan mythology, as we have shown in another work. So again, Paul and Barnabas don't have to do anything to appeal to the Gentiles other than to appeal to their own mythology. So contradicting God's word, throwing out the law, calling it attributable to angels, and all these horrific heresies and apostasy don't mean anything to a Gentile at all. It just goes in one ear and out the other. But if you were a Jewish person listening to us, you'd be outraged. You go, this is apostasy on steroids. That's Galatians 3:19, if you don't know what I'm referring to. Anyway, let's continue with the quote of Boulanger. These reflections are sufficient to explain to us the reason of the great success that the apostles Paul and Barnabas had in preaching to the Gentiles, compared with their endeavors among the Jews. They likewise show us especially the true motives of Paul's conduct. In fact, repulsed by the cavils and opposition of the Jews, we see Paul and Barnabas turn themselves to the side of the pagans, who listened to them with more attention and who declared to the Jews that God had forsaken them. So what he's saying is the message that Paul and Barnabas had for Jews is that God had forsaken them. So there's really not a positive message, and They're not. That's why they're going to focus on the Gentiles. So the reason we're going to the Gentiles is God is forsaking you Jews. So it's almost an anti-Semitic explanation given to the Gentiles of why we're not evangelizing the Jews. They refuse to listen to Christ's message. We're then going to you Gentiles. And in fact, that's in the book of Acts where Paul says that. He gets resistance at one synagogue in the Pisidia region, and he just simply says, "Well, since you've resisted, I'm no longer going to the Jews. I'm going to the Gentiles." But I digress. Let's keep going. Continue with Boulanger's quotes. The Gentiles were apparently flattered by the preference. Numbers of them adopted the religion announced to them, which did not hinder the Jews from exciting against our missionaries, Paul and Barnabas, the zeal of the female devotees whose clamor obliged them to quit Antioch. All right. I'm not quite sure what he meant by the last part there. Anyway, let's look at the next heading. Paul's improper and deceitful behavior with the high priest. And by the way, we have a whole video article on this because this is just a self-evident fact. But let's listen to how he presents this encounter with the high priest. This is in the book of Acts, by the way. Boulanger points out that the account in Acts of Paul's claim to not know he disrespected the high priest evinces much disingenuousness. And what do I mean by that? In my video article, it explains that the high priest has to go out with vestly garments mandated in the law. And on there is a gold plate on his head that says, I think it says righteousness of God on the plate. And so he's the only person who's allowed to wear these clothes and the only person who's mandated to wear that on their head, and nobody else can wear it. So that signifies that person is the high priest, and he can never go out of his house without that. Paul claimed in the book of Acts earlier on that he had worked for years for the high priests, right? And he was on missions to go. In fact, on the day he has the Damascus Road experience, he is on a mission to persecute Christians. In the prior episode in Acts 8, he's killing or participating in the stoning of Stephen, the young Christian evangelist. So he's claiming all this is done at the behest of the high priest. So what's the chance he doesn't know how the high priest wears clothing and has to wear the headdress that has the words in gold, and the only one who could and would wear it is the high priest? How could that Paul say, after he slanders the high priest as a whitewashed urinal wall? That's what he calls them. A whitewashed wall which is a urinal wall where men would pee in the middle of a town on lime so it wouldn't smell. So he's saying that's what you are, high priest. But when he's told it's the high priest, did you know it's the high priest? And he says, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was the high priest. Because you cannot slander or blaspheme your ruler. That's a sin. So Paul quotes the law on that. So he himself knows that. But the disingenuousness is his claim that he didn't know it was a high priest, because that high priest is sitting there in a court setting with him and is ordering people to slap Paul for lying, saying Paul had said, I've lived in all good conscience up to this day. That's what he testifies, which is hard to imagine because he participated in the murder of Stephen. And in 1 Timothy, I think it's 4:4, he admits that he was a blasphemer, which is actually the unpardonable sin. So it's another incongruity. But regardless, the point is, this is what Boulanger is referring to. So now with that background, let's read how he depicts the issues. Also, Paul's retort was not in keeping with Jesus' command to turn the other cheek. Now, that's another interesting thing that I didn't put in my article. So instead of doing what he should have done is to accept the slap, he speaks an insult on the high priest and then pretends he didn't know it was high priest. So anyway, let's continue here. He, Paul, first declared that in all he had done, he had followed strictly the dictates of his conscience. This is his first statement to the high priest. I've lived in all good conscience up to this day, is what he testifies in court under oath. At these words, the high priest gave him a box on the ear. Well, the high priest ordered someone to hit Paul, slap Paul on the face. At which Paul, irritated, instead of turning the other cheek, according to the precept of Jesus, abused the high priest, meaning verbally, treated him as a hypocrite or whitened wall. Yes, he called him a whitewashed wall, a urinal wall. But as he perceived that he had given offense by his insolence to a man respected by the Jews, he moderated himself and alleged that he was ignorant that it was the high priest whom he had thus addressed in such terms. An ignorance, however, which cannot fail to excite surprise. So Boulanger sees the same thing I pointed out. Considering that he was a man who must have been informed respecting the place where he was and the quality of those before whom he was speaking. So what he's saying, without even knowing what the law says about the headdress and the clothing, it's like you're sitting in the courtroom. You don't know the high priest is sitting and presiding over the proceeding. So it's just very obvious that even without knowing the scriptures, you would come to the same conclusion that we had in our episode on that. We'll take a break. Okay, next heading I put in here is Boulanger sees preposterousness in Paul's claim to having been taken up into the third heaven. Boulanger finds ill motives in Paul's assertion that he was taken into the third heaven to hear things which Paul was then not permitted to speak. Quote, and by the way, this is page 31. St. Paul, in speaking of himself, says that he knew a man who was caught up into the third heaven, and that there he heard unspeakable words which it was not lawful for man to utter. Notice the word not words, not lawful. So it's clearly he's prohibited from repeating what he's said. So you will find no quotes of Jesus speaking to him in the third heaven, except 2 Corinthians 12:7, where Paul prays 3 times to be released from the torment of an angel of Satan, and his Jesus refuses him, a whole nother problematical passage. But that's the only quote he has of Jesus speaking to him in this third heaven or outside of or in his brain, that when he's writing as an epistle. So that's the only quote of Jesus there that's unique. And then he doesn't ever quote Yahweh speaking to him, giving him a revelation. So here we go. So that's in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2-4. It appears in the first place that no one but a man of a very heated imagination could with sincerity pretend to have been caught up into the third heaven. And no one but an impostor could assert such a fact without being persuaded of it. In the second place, we may ask, of what use could it be to mankind that St. Paul should hear in the third heaven unspeakable words, that is to say, such as it was unlawful for man to utter? Pause there. A very good question. So why would God have all this revelation, building up, giving this person all this information, and never expect that person to quote God, Yahweh speaking, or Jesus speaking? What's the point of that? So people just have to take it on faith that your message is consistent with something you've heard in the third heaven, but it's impermissible for you to repeat it. But that's what Paul claims, and that's the only thing that explains why he has no quotes of Jesus at all, or of Yahweh, with the exception of, I said there, where his Jesus turned him down. He prayed 3 times to be released from a torment of an angel of Satan, and his Jesus said, "No, in your weakness is my strength." But we digress. So let's continue on. What should we think of a man who should come and assure us that he possessed a secret most important to our happiness, but yet one which he was not permitted to divulge? Pause there. Another good question. So, why in the world would his messages that he's getting be a secret? Meaning only he can know what they are. What's the point of that? One man knows it, and and then you just have to listen to this man because he's been talking or been talked to by God or Jesus in the third heaven, but not allowed to tell you what he said. And these messages are somehow being kind of channeled. And I want to use that. I'm deliberately using a new age term because it sounds a lot like channeling. So where you're claiming you're under the influence of a spirit, but you cannot quote that spirit. It's just flowing out of you in some way, but not in a verbatim way. So the whole thing is, it's not every word it's not like Jesus says, every word I speak is from the Father. Paul's saying none of the words I'm speaking is from Jesus or the Father. It's just I'm imbued with it, and I'm exhibiting words that are will lead you in the correct instruction, but I can't quote God or Jesus at all. So it's just a very obvious deficiency in listening to Paul when he tells you what it's based on and what his message is. I can't tell you what I've been told. It's just like, and why would God do that? It's just crazy stuff. It doesn't make sense. Let's continue. The voyage of St. Paul is either a chimera, like a dream, engendered by a sickly brain, or a fable contrived by a cheat. So either it's a sickly brain or a fable contrived by a cheat. So it's either total dishonesty or a person whose mind is deranged and kind of crazy, because it's just, even Paul should be saying, well, how can I be giving messages when I'm not allowed to tell anybody what the message I've received is? It's just, what kind of God is that? It's not the God of the Bible. God of the Bible talks to prophets, gives them a message, and wants it declared. That's the whole point of talking to them. So he has the inverse, the exact opposite kind of God that is the God of the Bible, to just be honest. And so what is that? It's obviously Satan. And that's why his Jesus in 2 Corinthians 12:7, his Jesus will not release him from angelos satanas, an angel of Satan that is, quote, tormenting. That's the actual Greek word, tormenting him. And he's prayed 3 times, please take it away from me. And then his Jesus refuses, saying, in your weakness is my strength. So as to suggest, and then tells him, this will keep you humble. So an angel of Satan is Jesus' method of making Paul humble. Instead of maybe teaching him, guiding him, explaining why boasting all the time is not a good thing. No, that's not what I'm going to do. Jesus says, I'm going to leave you subject to a tormented angel of Satan, and that'll teach you to be humble. That's what he literally says in 2 Corinthians 12:7. Please go look it up if you think I'm not telling you the truth. Anyway, thus the voyage of St. Paul is either a chimera engendered by a sickly brain or a fable contrived by a cheat who sought to make himself respected by boasting of the peculiar favors of the Almighty. Now, the way he says it there, does he think it's a sickly brain, a kind of a crazy person, or is it a person who's a fabulist, meaning making up stories that are not true? I think he's leaning towards the latter, but I end up leaning towards the, in other words, I am leaning that he literally was told, prayed to his Jesus, was literally turned down being, having a demon cast out of his body, and his Jesus gives him a ridiculous explanation. And what I've said over and over again, Paul is the most gullible person in the world, or he's the biggest liar there ever was. Okay, so I would put it there. But I honestly think he's so gullible, because why would you tell these really patently, obviously implausible the things that are implausible to believe are about the true God of the world, of the universe, and of Jesus refusing to turn someone down from being released from a torment of an angel of Satan? I mean, we're not talking about a little demon. We're not talking like a junior demon. We're talking an angel of Satan, a top dog to the big guy, Satan. So I don't know. Just kind of, I think it's more likely he's sincere in his delusions, meaning he believes the delusions are true and he just doesn't see through them. He doesn't perceive what he's experiencing is not from the true God of Yahweh or the true Jesus. Let's continue. This voyage then was perfectly useless, since it was not permitted him who made it to relate that which he learned from it. He's referring back to the trip to the third heaven. This is in 2 Corinthians 12. And he's saying, then what was the whole point of your trip to the third heaven if you can't tell us anything, what you learned there? So it's useless. So why even tell us about it? But he told us about it. But let's read what he next says, because I think this is he's going to come to a tough conclusion here. In short, there is malice in St. Paul, thus irritating the curiosity of his hearers and refusing to satisfy it. So in other words, he's saying that Paul, giving no explanation for this, which it defies common sense, defies the idea of the God of the Bible, that the very fact he won't tell you, he thinks is malicious. He's maliciously so he's describing to Paul malice in not explaining himself. That's interesting. So I think that's a very harsh statement to make. He's malicious. It's not an oversight. He's deliberately not telling you why he can't tell you. he's telling you it's illicit or illegal for him to tell you what he learned in the third heaven, but he's not telling you why. Why would God ever do that? And he's saying that's a malicious silence. So I've never heard people talk like that, but it's an argument. It's arguably true. Under whatever point of view that we behold this history or tale of Paul's ravishment into the third heaven, it can be of no utility to us and reflects but little honor upon himself. So ultimately, all of Paul's writings come from the third heaven, but he can't tell you what words he heard. So it's sort of like a waste of your time. Thank you for telling us what it might be, but you didn't quote him. So God tells us not to follow anyone who will not quote God Yahweh, with the exception that the prophet who comes in Deuteronomy 18, God's going to hold him accountable to every word he speaks, because he is, in essence, a king whose every word is law when he comes out of his mouth. And Jesus explains, every word you hear is not my own. It belongs to the Father who sent me. All right. Anyway, the point is that this whole thing, the whole message of Paul is destroyed by 2 Corinthians 12. And that's for multiple reasons. All right. God bless. We're going to stop it there, and we're going to come back with another episode in Probably by tomorrow. Ciao, bye.